Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. I'm your host Brian, and today I'm standing by a very big tree. I have actually never been down by this very big tree, and I'm wondering just how old this big tree is. I mean, look at it, I can't even get my hands around it. At any rate, this month we are going to talk about a story with William Wirt Pendergast where he meets and gives a great description of Mdewakanton leader Little Crow. And also we'll travel to a couple of different sites. We're gonna go take a look at the Crow River with a little bit of Crow River history on how it got its name. And we're also gonna go take a trip into downtown Hutchinson and look at the site where Little Crow was actually buried when he was first brought in from Hutchinson after he was killed. So thank you everybody, and join me on a history quest. Here we are at the intersection of Hassan and Washington in Hutchinson, Minnesota, the present day site of Ace Hardware. If we were to look down just a little bit farther, over 150 years ago, we would have been looking at an Indian encampment. A few years later, they had turned the area into a dump. And as a matter of fact, in this intersection is roughly the spot where the settlers buried Little Crow after he was taken back from the site where he was killed, just north of here a little bit. They brought him in and they buried him right in this area, and then later that night, I believe, the body was exhumed and brought to a different location. And that's a whole other story for a whole other episode, but it's just kind of hard to imagine with all this, you know, all the street signs and the street lights and the buildings and the cars going by, that this was actually the site of an Indian camp at one point. Later it was even used as a city dump, and then when Pendergast built a house in the area, they decided that couldn't live next to a dump, so the city cleaned it up and just kind of progressed to what we have here today.
In 1857, the city of Hutchinson was anything but. In fact, to call it a city would be a huge overstatement. Hutchinson was, like most North Country communities of the time, little more than a collection of roughly hewn log structures gathered along the bank of the Crow River. There were certainly no streets in the classic sense, nor did the town possess any real sense of industry or public work. To put it best, Hutchinson in 1857 was a tiny settlement in a sea of northern frontier. It was only a short number of years prior that the area was an expansive piece of wilderness void of settlers. Those who claimed the land as their own were the Dakota Sioux. And though they passed through the area numerous times, no permanent village of theirs was ever in the vicinity. In 1851, as part of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, the Dakota sold a large portion of their real estate to the United States and moved west to the reservation. The land was now opened and available for legal settlement of white settlers. Though the Dakota no longer held title to the land, they still passed through on occasion, mostly to rest in temporary camps while on hunting excursions. It was on one such a trip that one of history's most famous figures, at least in Minnesota, Little Crow, became acquainted with the white settlers that were now living along the river. It was fall, prime season for hunting big game on the divide of the big woods and prairie. Little Crow and 100 of his followers of Mdewakanton, Dakota, were on a hunting expedition that took them through the area. They set up camp down the river of the white settlement, likely planning to send hunting parties through the river bottom and wooded savannas in the area. To most white settlers in Hutchinson, the site of the encampment was something of a spectacle. Many were new to Minnesota and had scarcely seen a band of Dakota. One group of young men from town decided to stroll down to the camp and visit the Indians. One of them was William Wirt Pendergast, one of Hutchinson's earliest residents. At the time, it was customary and acceptable to the Dakota for curious white settlers to walk right into an Indian lodge unannounced. Of course, Pendergast was only following custom when he walked into a lodge and realized it belonged to the famous Dakota leader, Little Crow. Pendergast would later become well acquainted with the chief, but his first view of the man left him with a favorable impression. So much that he recorded it and would often recount it. In Pendergast's own words, the chief was about 35 years old, 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall, very slender, and straight. He'd weigh probably about 135 pounds, long black hair that was well taken care of, and small, delicate hands and feet, with handsome beaded moccasins. He was well dressed but not gaudy, had a heavy chin, a wide, square mouth, and a prominent nose, slightly rounded, full over the eyes and a retreating forehead, lighter complexioned than most of the Indians, and his eyes at first seemed mild. The first impression that I had was that he was a man of more than ordinary intelligence, of a quiet disposition, friendly and the very opposite of cruel. I saw this gentleman many times afterward, and every time noticed some new expression about his eyes. When he spoke, which was seldom, giving an order or a command, his voice was very low and soft. Half of his talk was with his hands. I noticed that when the command was given in the quiet, soft voice without any excitement, his orders were instantly obeyed. No king or general had better control than this small, quiet man. One instinctively felt that when in his presence, he was a man not to be trifled with. When the Great Sioux War broke out, he very naturally assumed command as head chief. Little Crow would later return to Hutchinson, often on hunting excursions just as this one. His group even wintered one year in the grove of Dr. Benjamin, Hutchinson's main medical man of the time. He would return again in 1862, but this time to attempt to destroy the town as the Dakota were at war with the whites. Eventually, he would be killed outside of town by 2 Hutchinson men and brought into the town. Today, a memorial stands north of Hutchinson where he was killed, and a statue stands along the Crow River to commemorate his memory. Truly a man of great standing in this community still today.
Here we are at the South Fork of the Crow River in Hutchinson, Minnesota. It's part of the Crow River tributary, which is one of the major waterways in Minnesota that flows into the Mississippi River, which later empties out by Louisiana. So this water will eventually be in Louisiana, down in the Atlantic Ocean. At any rate, a lot of people don't realize it, but in order for civilization to exist, and this is prior to the advent of the railroad, that the town, settlement, city had to be built alongside of either a river, a canal, the ocean, or some sort of major waterway where travel was possible. Reasons for that are chiefly that out on the frontier, where there were no roads and just few trails, rivers were actually used as the main landmark, so people would know where they were going by following the river. Therefore, your towns sprang up along the river. Another reason, however, is that the river was a means of transportation by boats coming up and down the river, as well as the trail running alongside of the river. So, in order to have a settlement, you had to have some sort of means of transportation to get to and from that settlement and to get your goods to and from that settlement. And in most cases, that's your waterway, like the river. If you look on a map of the United States or a map of the world and you start looking at where the towns and cities, settlements, villages are located, they're all located along the river until about the 1870s. Once you hit the 1870s, then your towns start being located basically out in the middle of nowhere. And the reason for that is because with the railroad, you're able to transport goods to that town by rail. But like I said, prior to that, you had to depend on the river. Now, on the South Fork here, they actually at one point had a steamboat that would travel the river and try to get as close to the Mississippi as they could. The only problem is, with the Crow River being narrow in places and with water levels going up and down, they weren't able to maintain the steamboat on the river. So it only lasted for about 5 years before they decided not to use steamboats on the river. But that being said, that's just kind of the short history of why the river is so important to not just this community, but every community along the Crow River and into the Mississippi. Prior to the white settlement being here, the Native Americans used the river for the same purposes. They would set their campsites up along the river, and they would also use the river to travel. One interesting note was they also thought that storms, bad weather, would follow the rivers, so they would try to use that to their advantage with the terrain on the river when they would select their campsites. As far as the Crow River goes, the Dakota named it the Hutchinson, which means the large wing feather of the Crow River. The Ojibwa called it Unigsipi, which actually just translates to Crow River. The first whites to look at the Crow River, the first whites to explore the Crow River, did so while trying to find the source of the Mississippi River. Now, granted, the source of the Mississippi River is going to be up at Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. These explorers, Zebulon Pike, Joseph Nicolet, they always had Indian guides with them because they knew the lay of the land, they knew where the river was going to flow. The first white explorer to map out the Crow River was Jonathan Carver. You probably know the name for Carver County. He mapped it out and he called it the Goose River. What's interesting though is Jonathan Carver didn't get any credit for mapping out the Crow River. So in 1823, another European explorer tried to find the source of the Mississippi River, and while doing so, mapped out the Crow. His name was Giacomo Beltrami, and Beltrami called it the Rook River. A few years later, you have the last person to map it out, and his name was Joseph Nicolet, again of Nicolet County. You'll notice that all of these people, these explorers, have a county in Minnesota named after him. Completely a different subject, another story. Anyway, Joseph Nicolet named it the Karashon River, and which was kind of a play off of the pronunciation that the Dakota called it, and it, according to him, it translated also as Crow River. But he mapped out all three of them and found the source of the Mississippi at Itasca Lake. Anyway, that is just kind of a brief history of the Crow River, how it got its name, the different names that it's had. When white settlers began settling along the Crow River, they all had their own names for it. Where I come from, up north in the North Fork, they called the Crow River the Pleasant River. Here in Hutchinson, a lot of the settlers refer to it as the Hassan River. So that's a brief history of the Crow River, how it got its name and why it's important to our history. So I just want to say thanks for watching. And also I want to remind people that we have a monthly event, the Breakfast Club, on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 10:30. For the month of July, we'll have Ralph Johnson come to speak about old-time baseball. For the month of August, I'll actually be speaking, so if you're not tired of listening to me now, you can come to the museum and listen to me some more. We'll be talking about the Dakota Conflict, Sioux Uprising, kind of a roundtable discussion. Then in September, we will be having Gary Lenz from Winsted, Minnesota, come to talk about McLeod County Railroad history. So don't miss out on those events. They should be a great time. All three of them are the fourth Tuesday of each month at 10:30. Also on September 15th, we have Craig Bishop coming to the museum to talk about his book, Billy Sunday, the Baseball Evangelist. And one last thing, we are co-hosting a bus trip with Hutchinson Senior Center, and they will be traveling to the Oliver Kelly Farm in Elk River, Minnesota. The farm is owned and managed by the State Historical Society, and they have reenactors there and they have tour guides and everything. If you want more information on that, you can stop down at the McLeod County Historical Society, or you can contact the Hutchinson Senior Center, and they'll give you the dates and the times and the registrations and fees and everything else. But that is all I have for you this month, so thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again next month for another interesting story about McLeod County history. Thanks, everybody.